Today, we are not simply going to talk about food. We are not going to talk only about bread, wine, or fruit. We are going to talk about the act of eating as one of the deepest spiritual spaces of human existence. Most people eat automatically. They eat out of habit, for pleasure, out of routine, or because of anxiety. But in the Torah, and especially in Mishnah Berakhot 6:1, eating is a conscious act, classified, ordered, and charged with cosmic meaning. This Mishnah, which might seem simple on the surface, establishes something revolutionary. Not all food is the same. There are levels. There are hierarchies. There are foods that touch deeper layers of spiritual reality, and therefore receive an exclusive blessing, a special language, a higher level of attention. Bread and wine. But this distinction is not accidental. According to the sages, humanity's first great transgression, the sin in the Garden of Eden, did not occur with a sword, nor with a war, nor with violence. It occurred when humankind extended its hand and ate. The fall of man began with an act of eating. And this is where this Mishnah takes on a much greater dimension. The very substances that were linked to the origin of sin, wheat and the vine, are transformed on Shabbat into instruments of rectification. Bread and wine cease to be symbols of the fall, to become symbols of holiness, of order, of conscious obedience, and of connection with the divine. In this class, we will discover that every time you say hamotzi or borei peri hagafen, you are not repeating an ancient formula. You are participating in a process of tikkun, of spiritual repair of the world. You are rewriting, in miniature, the story of Eden. And the most surprising thing is this: you don't need to be a priest, nor a prophet, nor a sage on a mountain. You only need a table, a piece of bread, a glass of wine, and consciousness. Today we will understand why the Jewish table on Shabbat is not just a table, it is an altar. And every meal that is properly blessed is one more step toward the world as it should have been from the beginning. I, Abel Flores, I am very grateful that you are sharing your time with us in this free Mishnah course. Thank you very much for being here. Let's begin. This Mishnah that we will study today addresses the appropriate blessings for different types of food before consuming them, of course. It is located in the tractate of Berakhot, chapter 6, teaching Mishnah 1, and it says the following. Regarding the fruits of the tree, one says, "He who creates the fruit of the tree, except for wine." Although it comes from the fruit of the tree, its importance is different. Therefore, regarding wine, one says, "He who creates the fruit of the vine." Regarding fruits that grow from the earth, one says, "He who creates the fruit of the earth," except for bread. Even though it comes from the earth, its significance is greater. Therefore, regarding bread, one says, "He who brings forth bread from the earth." Regarding herbs and vegetables, one says, "He who creates the fruit of the earth." Rabbi Yehudah maintains that a distinction should be made between the fruits of the earth, herbs, and vegetables. Although they all come from the earth, their natures differ. Therefore, regarding the latter, one says, "He who creates various kinds of herbs." Before beginning to explain this lesson, we must emphasize that the tractate of Berakhot, the first of both the Mishnah and the Talmud, begins with the tractate of Berakhot, blessings. And before anything else, it begins with the Shema, the recitation of the Shema, which is the most important commandment of the Torah, along with "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Before moving on to the topic of prayer, the main prayer, which is the Amidah, or the Shemone Esrei, as it was known in the time of the Second Temple. As you can see, before praying for material things, even for food, the tractate of Berakhot emphasizes prayer, the belief in a single all-powerful God, and this is based on the declaration of the prophet Moses when he writes, "Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." That is to say, everything spiritual is relevant. However, the material also needs to be exalted, and therefore, from this chapter, we will begin to study the blessings or prayers dedicated to food. Because in the Garden of Eden, sin, error, entered through the mouth like food. That's how important food is, according to biblical accounts. Now, let's imagine for a moment that we enter a kitchen. The air smells of freshly baked bread. There's a glass of wine waiting on the table, and fruits, vegetables, and herbs rest on the counter. Everything seems ordinary, but the Mishnah Berakhot 6:1 whispers something in our ear. Nothing here is simple. Each food requires a different blessing, because each one reveals a different piece of the mystery of creation. Remember that in the Genesis account, creation unfolded species by species, each according to its kind, the biblical text says several times. And here lies the secret of the differences between foods. Each one was created differently. But what are these differences? This is precisely what we will talk about today. And so our journey begins. What is fascinating about this Mishnah, Tractate Berakhot, Order Zerim, chapter 6, is that it establishes the spiritual architecture of food according to the Torah, according to divine law. It is not a technical list. It is, if you allow me the expression, a map of the soul for every bite. The sages take the plant world, examine it closely, and say, this is not the same as that, and that isn't either. And with that precision, they construct the liturgy of blessings. First, the Mishnah speaks to us of the fruits of the tree, perot hailan, and with an almost poetic elegance it offers the formula, bore peri haetz, who creates the fruit of the tree? But you know how Judaism is. When everything seems perfectly ordered, an exception appears that makes one think. Wine. The grape could have comfortably remained under haetz, but no, because wine is not squeezed grapes. It is culture, it is ceremony, it is sanctified joy. That is why the Mishnah crowns it with its own blessing. Bore peri hagafen. The vine, gafen in Hebrew, is not merely a plant. It is the protagonist of ritual. Kiddush, Havdalah, weddings, Brit Milah. Wine is always there, as if it were the spiritual notary of Jewish history. Then the Mishnah looks downward, to the soil, to what grows from the earth, and it gives us the general formula, bore peri hadama, vegetables, legumes, fruits that come from non-perennial plants. And here a technical rule appears, which seems botanical, but is in fact pure halakha. A tree is that whose trunk remains from one year to the next. If it dies and grows again from below, it is not a tree. That is why the banana, the pineapple, and the strawberry, even though in the fruit shop they are displayed with aristocratic flair, are halakhically not ha'etz, but ha'adamah. The trunk carries more authority than the popular name. And as if the Mishnah also wished to teach us pedagogy, it shows us something beautiful. Ha'adamah is more general than ha'etz. If someone makes a mistake and says ha'adamah over an apple, they have nevertheless fulfilled their obligation. Why? Because even the tree, in the end, comes from the earth. It is a kind of theological hierarchy. The earth embraces the tree, but the tree does not embrace the earth. Then comes the bread. Ah, the bread. And here the Mishnah becomes solemn. Bread should fall under ha'adamah, but it does not. It would be like saying that Beethoven is merely music, technically true, spiritually insufficient. Bread, says the Mishnah, deserves hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings forth bread from the earth. And behind that phrase lies an entire philosophy. Bread is the food that requires the greatest human intervention, to sow, to harvest, to grind, to knead, to bake. It is a covenant between heaven and human sweat. And that is why it receives birkat hamazon, after being eaten, the only extended thanksgiving of biblical origin recited after a food. If wine is joy, bread is civilization. Vegetables and herbs, for their part, fit comfortably into hadamah. But Rabbi Yehudah raises his hand, as a particularly creative student would, and objects. Why give them the same blessing as a tomato or a potato? Let us instead say, Bore mine deshaim, who creates various kinds of herbs. The idea is beautiful, almost botanical, but the Halakha chooses not to follow him. Why? Because excessive multiplication of blessings can confuse more than it enlightens. Sometimes unity helps more than precision. From this Mishnah emerges a series of extremely fine halakhic criteria. What is a tree? What is of the earth? How the hierarchy of specificity functions. Why, in cases of doubt, the more general blessing is chosen. How bread and wine govern the rest of the table. Even the principle of ikar v'tafel, although not explicit here, pulses in the background. Distinguishing what is primary from what is secondary is part of the same philosophy that distinguishes between bread, wine, tree, and earth. And of course, all this is not merely an academic exercise. At today's table, this Mishnah still determines what we say over a cookie, a plate of pasta, a salad, or a glass of grape juice. Bread is hamotzi. Pasta and cereals derived from the 5 grains become mezzanote, that category that breathes between the lines of our text. Wine and grape juice, even when pasteurized, remain hagafen. Apple cider, on the other hand, falls under shehakol, because it does not possess the ontological magic of wine. But perhaps the deepest element is what this Mishnah says about consciousness. Before eating, the sages ask us to pause for an instant, to look at what we are holding in our hand, to recognize its origin, to name it. Because eating without thought is biology, but eating with a blessing is applied spirituality. It is knowing that daily life, at its simplest level, can become a laboratory of gratitude. Bread and wine are the greater symbols, sustenance and joy, human effort and the sanctification of time. But even the humble carrot or the small strawberry, ha'adamah, let us not forget, compel us to recognize that everything that exists is bound to the earth, that silent mother who sustains creation. Thus, Mishnah Berakhot 6.1 leaves us with a clear and luminous message. Nothing is trivial, not even what we eat. Each blessing is an act of spiritual classification, a way of ordering the world, an invitation to awareness. And perhaps, if uttered with intention, each bite becomes a small act of revelation. Because in the end, food does not only nourish the body, it nourishes perception, and the correct blessing nourishes the soul. Now, we enter a segment of the class that basically seeks to answer one of the titles of this class. Why do bread and wine have a special blessing? There is a scene that is repeated every Friday night, a lit table, 2 hollow loaves covered with a cloth, a cup of wine awaiting its moment, and a silence that precedes the singing of the Kiddush. Everything seems part of an age-old choreography, but behind that scene, there is a burning question. Why do bread and wine occupy the symbolic center of Shabbat? What do these 2 products have that the fruits of the tree, vegetables, or any other food do not? And even more intriguing, what does all this have to do with the mystery of the Garden of Eden? Let's start with the firmest point, the halakhic point. Wine receives borei peri hagafen, a unique blessing. It is not just another derivative of the tree, it is a world of its own. And on Shabbat and Yom Tov, to proclaim the sanctity of the day, Halakha requires that the Kiddush be recited, ideally over a cup of wine. It is as if the wine opens the spiritual door to sacred time. The cup is not only filled with liquid, it is filled with memory, with promises, with the solemn declaration that Shabbat begins now. Bread is not far behind. The bread made from the 5 grains receives hamotzi lahem min haaretz and establishes the meal. Where there is bread, there is a complete meal. And on Shabbat, that presence is doubled. Lahem Mishna, 2 loaves in remembrance of the double portion of manna that descended before Shabbat. The challah loaves then become small capsules of history. They remind us that abundance did not begin in the bakery, but in the desert, when heaven itself fed the people. So far, the Halakha. But to understand why bread and wine are the kings of the Jewish table, we must look further. We must return to the first garden, to the first no of the Torah, to the forbidden tree of Eden. And here the tradition becomes delightfully speculative. The Midrashim ask, what fruit was it from the tree of knowledge? The answers are varied, and each opens a different conceptual door. Some say it was a fig, because they covered themselves with fig leaves after sinning. Others suggest it was wheat. Yes, wheat, even though it grew like a tree. And there is a third opinion that identifies it with the vine. If the fruit was wheat, then humanity's first sin was linked to the food that today transforms any table into a complete meal. Wheat, transformed by human beings, becomes bread, a basic food, a symbol of human effort. And if the fruit was the grape, then the primordial error had to do with that which can bring joy or confusion, holiness or lack of control, wine. So what are bread and wine doing at the center of the Shabbat table? Exactly the opposite of what happened in Eden. In the garden, the fruit, whatever it was taken without awareness, without blessing, without restraint, without dialogue. On Shabbat, the bread and wine are taken with profound awareness, with words that elevate, with a ritual act that orders desire and transforms impulse into holiness. It is as if every Friday night, humanity returns to the tree. But this time, to choose differently. In other words, bread and wine are the great rectifiers of Eden. Bread repairs the relationship between human labor and divine sustenance. Wine repairs the relationship between enjoyment and responsibility, between joy and consciousness. That is why they are the highest blessings, not only because of technical hierarchy, but because they represent two essential dimensions of life, the effort that bears fruit and the joy that is sanctified. Two pillars that support the table, two paths that order existence, two reminders that humanity can transform its history, even starting with bread and wine. And every Shabbat, when we pronounce hagafen and hamotzi, when we raise the cup and break the challah, we are doing more than just fulfilling a Halakha. We are responding, once again, to the oldest question in the world. What do we do with the fruit that is given to us? Do we repeat the impulse of Eden, or do we redeem it? At the Shabbat table, week after week, we choose redemption, and we do it with a sip of wine and a piece of bread. At this point, we've reached the halfway mark of this class, so we're taking a short break to let you know that if you're willing to make a donation, you can do so by scanning the QR code you see on the screen, or by clicking the link below in the description of this video. Personally, I, Abel Flores, sincerely thank you for your contribution, because it helps us a lot in continuing to produce all this content, which is free for everyone, and thus giving more people the opportunity to learn about these ancient teachings. You can also help us a lot by subscribing to this channel, La Mishna TV, giving us a like, and sharing this video on your social media and messaging apps. Thank you very much. Also, you should know that on our website, lamishna.com, you will find all these classes, supporting materials, texts, articles, reports, and supplementary information for our free course on the Mishnah. Now, don't go anywhere, because we're continuing with our class. Now, allow me to invite you, with a bit of imagination, into the narrative heart of Genesis, not the abstract paradise of medieval paintings, but a living garden, filled with aromas, where every fruit seems to speak. Human history begins there, and there too, curiously, our spiritual relationship with food begins. The first detail the Torah gives us is simple, almost innocent. God places Adam in Gan Eden and gives him permission to eat from almost everything. Almost. One tree remains off the menu, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what is remarkable is that the first human act that breaks the divine order is not a violent gesture or a philosophical rebellion. It is a bite, an act of eating, consuming what was not yet meant to be consumed, crossing a boundary without asking permission, without waiting for the proper time. That simple and that revealing. The sages, who rarely leave any detail unexamined, ask themselves what fruit that forbidden tree actually was, not out of botanical curiosity, but because each identification reveals a different spiritual reading. Rabbi Yehudah, in Berakhot 40a, proposes a bold idea. The tree was wheat, and not wheat as we know it today, bent and humble, but wheat that grew like a tall tree, almost as if it offered ready-made loaves to be taken. In that framework, the moment when a child tastes grain and learns to say father and mother becomes evidence. Wheat awakens knowledge. Other midrashim, with the same speculative elegance that characterizes rabbinic literature, speak of the vine, of Eve squeezing grapes and offering primordial wine to Adam. The grape, which can innocently refresh a summer day, can also become wine, and wine can uplift or confuse. It is, in a way, a mirror of the human condition. The same raw material can lead either to heaven or to stumbling. Let us summarize this point as a good teacher would. According to these interpretations, the very object of the first sin is made of the two substances that today crown the Shabbat table: wheat, which becomes bread, and grapes, which become wine. This is not accidental. It is spiritual geometry. And then comes the divine sentence that marked human history. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. Bread ceases to be a gift of the garden and becomes a conquest of effort. Every loaf, since then, is a symbol of human labor, of the loss of immediate divinity, of the distance between heaven and earth. But the story does not end in exile, because tradition adds an unexpected turn. Midrashim and Sepharim assert that if Adam had waited just a few more hours until the first Shabbat began, he would have been able to eat from the tree of knowledge without sin. The problem was not the fruit, it was the impatience, the mistimed moment, eating without a framework, eating without the divine word that authorized the act. And here the tikkun begins. Every Shabbat reopens the atmosphere of Gan Eden. Shabbat is Me'ain Olam Haba, a foretaste of the repaired world, a day in which creation realigns, even if only for an instant, with its harmonious origin. That is why eating on Shabbat is not simply filling the stomach. It is a liturgy that repairs what was broken in the garden. Now let us return to the wheat. If the tree was wheat, then the sin was taking a food that was ready before its appointed time. And the punishment was to see that wheat reduced, transformed into a plant that demands hours of labor, sweat, technique, and patience. And what do we do on Shabbat? We take that same fallen wheat, transform it into bread, lift it in our hands, cover it with a cloth that recalls the manna, and say, hamotzi lehem min haaretz. It is as if we were declaring, this bread is not produced by me alone. I do the work, yes, but the life that pulses within it is not mine. Exactly the opposite of what Adam did. The two chalot, the Lekha Mishna, are even more symbolic. They recall the manna, the pre-sin food, the food from heaven that required neither sowing nor harvesting. It was pure trust, pure dependence, pure grace. Eating bread on Shabbat is therefore the merging of two worlds, the wheat that fell and the manna that descended, the union of human sweat with divine generosity, the transformation of daily effort into conscious gratitude. And now the vine. If the tree was the vine, then the sin has to do with drinking a knowledge for which humanity was not yet ready, with allowing a substance that can elevate to also confuse. It is no coincidence that later Noah stumbles because of wine. It is a pattern. The human being wrestles with the power of bottled joy. But on Shabbat, we make kiddush over wine, over the very same raw material that, according to one opinion, brought about the fall. Only now, its use changes completely. The wine that revealed shadows now reveals light. The wine that could bring out the worst now brings forth the sod, the hidden secret of Shabbat. For niknas yayin, yatsa sod. When wine enters, the hidden emerges. On Shabbat, what emerges is the holiness of time. The word that once misled now sanctifies. The mouth that once ate without awareness now pronounces kiddush. The Hasidic masters formulated with a clarity that penetrates the soul. Desire is not destroyed, it is redirected. Pleasure is not cancelled, it is ordered. Wine remains wine. The grape remains a grape. Bread remains bread. The difference is not in the substance, but in the framework that sustains it. The right time, the right word, the right intention. That is where a common action is transformed into a sacred act. And here we arrive at the heart of tikkun. As Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin expresses it with a simplicity that conceals an abysmal depth. Adam's sin was not only what he ate, but how he ate. It was not the object of the act. It was the consciousness with which it was performed. He ate without kavanah, without a blessing, without giving place to the divine voice. It was an automatic, impulsive act, disconnected from the Creator. Therefore, the repair of eating does not consist in changing the food, but in enveloping it in words, in intention, in consciousness. That is why, before the wine, we say kiddush. Before the bread, we say hamotzi. After the meal, birkat hamazon. These are not empty ritual formulas. They are a fence of holiness around the act that was once the source of the fall. What was once a crack now becomes a door. What once separated humanity from the divine now reunites it. On a deeper level, Kabbalah unfolds a true conceptual symphony. Bread represents the earth, stability, the concrete, receptivity. It is inheritance. It is structure. It is permanence. Wine, on the other hand, represents fluidity, joy, inner mystery, that which descends from higher worlds. Bread belongs to the realm of matter, wine to the realm of spirit. Eating both on Shabbat is like uniting body and soul in a single gesture. The table ceases to be a simple piece of furniture and becomes an altar. The food ceases to be merely sustenance and is transformed into an offering. And time ceases to be linear to become a harmony that approaches the origin. So if one wants to understand the Garden of Eden, one doesn't need to travel back in time. It's enough to look at the Shabbat table. There are the bread and wine, the two substances associated, according to the Midrash, with the possible original sin, now transformed into tools of sanctification. Each meal is a small rehearsal of redemption. The wine that could confuse now illuminates. The bread that was born from the sweat of the brow now rises with gratitude. What was once a symbol of exile now becomes a symbol of return. In the garden, humankind fell by eating. On Shabbat, week after week, they rise again by eating. But this time, they do it with awareness, with words, within the right time. And that simple gesture, a sip of wine, a piece of bread, becomes the deepest echo of the world we were created to inhabit, and of the world to which, in some way, we try to return. Now let's imagine for a moment Rav Tzadok HaKohen entering the story of the Garden of Eden as a true spiritual detective. He doesn't dwell on the botany. He doesn't discuss whether the fruit was wheat, vine, or fig. He doesn't argue about the serpent or its characteristics. He goes straight to the invisible core of the story. How did Adam and Eve eat? With what awareness? With what intention? With what inner silence? And there he discovers something that, once seen, can no longer be ignored. According to Rav Tzadok, the tree of knowledge is not just a plant. It is a state of mind. It is the way in which human beings relate to reality. Eating without awareness is the true forbidden fruit. Eating impulsively, out of anxiety, out of immediate desire, without pause, without blessing, without presence. That is the true exile of the soul. From this perspective, tikkun, the repair, ceases to be an abstract concept and becomes something tremendously concrete, learning to eat with intention. To recognize before each bite that life does not belong to us by right, but is given to us by grace. That is why Judaism surrounds food with words. Blessings before, blessings after. Because what was broken with the mouth can only be repaired with the mouth. And on Shabbat, this process reaches its fullness. Everything is carefully ordered. Before the wine, kiddush. Before the bread, hamotzi. After eating, birkat hamazon. The entire eating experience is enveloped in a fabric of words that bring consciousness back to the center. The chaos of Eden is transformed into sacred order. Impulsivity is transformed into liturgy. The mouth that once fell now becomes an instrument of elevation. And Rav Tzadok seems to whisper from his writings, "Do you see? The tikkun, rectification, was always within reach, right there at the table." That's all for today's class. See you in the next video.